We're all pretty familiar with the interview in our lives. We've been interviewed at school, at university, in jobs, in a medical setting, and we've seen or read interviews with others. We know the score, we know the format, we know what to do and how to do it. Our society is being called the interview or even the confessional society. Many of us will have undertaken interviews ourselves, and most of these will have been qualitative interviews in the broadest sense. One person asking another person questions on a particular topic or issue, and the other one responding. We also know from our own experience that these interviews can differ widely. For example, from the confidential probing of the medical interview in a relatively private space, through the publicly oriented celebrity interviews, to the aggressive questioning of a politician by a television journal broadcast in the national news. So both the immediate and the broader social context are relevant to the way that the interview will be conducted, experienced and understood. So I'm going to give a plug. In my talk I will be talking about a book written by Ros Edwards and myself, available on the stalls, where we wanted to build on this general knowledge of interviews to switch focus onto the interview as a methodological and research tool. A major theme coursing through the book is how the researcher needs to approach research and methodological tools. In general, I think we all know, a researcher will construct their methodology by drawing on their philosophical stance and theoretical approach to understanding the social world, which leads to a choice of research concern or topic, to the generation of research questions that need to be answered, and to the selection of appropriate methods. We don't undertake qualitative interviews just because everybody else does, or we like them, although we might, but because they're an appropriate method within this framework. Jennifer Mason has suggests that despite large variations in style and tradition, all qualitative and semi-structured interviewing has certain characteristics in common. The interaction or exchange of dialogue between two or more participants in face-to-face or other context, a thematic, topic-centred biographical or narrative approach where the researcher has topics, themes or issues they wish to cover, but with a fluid and flexible structure. A perspective that regards knowledge as situated and contextual, requiring the researcher to ensure that relevant contexts are brought into focus so that the situated knowledge can be produced. Meanings and understandings are created in an interaction, which is effectively a co-production involving the construction or the reconstruction of knowledge. So an interview is also a potentially learning event for all participants. Qualitative interviewing demands many intellectual and social skills. It needs planning, it needs a deep knowledge of your area of study and research questions, and the capacity to move flexibly around in that knowledge. The ability to listen and to hear, the main thing, to think on your feet and to react with speed and coherence in the face-to-face situation with the interviewee. It requires time and practice to acquire these skills. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, just hitting a few main points, the form that qualitative interviews can take, the importance of the place and space of an interview, power and emotional dynamics, and challenges for the qualitative interview in the current context. So it forms that's what I'm going to do. This is what I usually do. Forget to put my overhead on. But anyway, that tells you what it is I said I was going to do. And now here's the forms. So the basic form of the interview derives from anthropology, but is now widely used in other social science disciplines, and is the ethnographic interview. As part of an ethnography, it's already a multi-method approach. A further series of interview types that elicit the participant's own story have different specific focuses, which comes from their research approach. Oral history, life course, biographical and narrative interviews. Each of these is seen as giving access not just to an individual story, but to the historical, social and cultural context in which an individual story is embedded, and which the individual is embedded themselves. Interviews can include more than an individual, of course. There are couple and group interviews of various kinds. Brian Heafy and Anna Einersdottir, who interviewed couples who were in a civil partnership, both together and apart. They interviewed them together and apart. They conclude that the narratives are the product of the situated interactional context in which they emerge and involve the negotiation of agency and constraint, or put another way, they involve complex flows of power. These themes also run through what we think about qualitative interviews. Anyway, space and place make an important contribution to qualitative interviewing, and their implications need to be considered at different levels of the research process, at the design level, analysis and interpretation. Pragmatic sort of approach suggests that you find a space that's available, convenient and accessible for the participant and the researcher, where you can avoid interruption and make adequate sound recording. Any experienced researcher will smile at this point, thinking of the places and spaces in which they have undertaken interviews, and some probably met none of these criteria. Researchers can offer the choice of setting to the interviewees who might choose a public space where they feel comfortable, a cafe, a pub, a park. Privacy and the possibility of noise that will affect the recording and actually being able to hear each other are concerns here. These concerns can also apply to workplaces of different types, factories, a prison, an open plan office, a school staff room, a university. If there are other people who could hear or enter the space of the interview, tension could be created for the interviewer and interviewee and affect how or what can be discussed. But this is not all that you have to think about. For example, if you do think about the workplaces that I just mentioned, factory, prison, open plan office, etc., hierarchies of gender, class, age, ethnicity, and other dimensions leap almost unbidden into mind. Positionings in multiple hierarchies are aspects of the multiple identities of individuals or groups, but these positionings are experienced, created, and enacted in places. And aspects of identity can be evoked in particular spaces and places, and all of this affects the responses of the participants. To access children in school, for example, a researcher needs to negotiate multiple levels of power and control within the organisation. And once in contact with the children, the adult-child power relation itself colours the interactions. But also, if you interview in people's homes, they have their own sort of micro-geographies and sets of familial power relations. And spaces in homes that are available for research vary considerably with the social positioning of the participants, as I know from many interviews that I've conducted in people's homes. Sarah Elwood and Deborah Martin put these thoughts that I've just put to you about location into a broader context, suggesting that the interview site itself produces micro-geographies of social-spatial relations and meanings that reflect the relationship of the researcher with the participant with the site, and the site in the broader socio-cultural power context, both of these, or all of these, affecting both the researcher and participants. Here's another example of an increasingly popular method, the walking interview, and it's an example that builds explicitly on the access that space and place can provide workers into the lives, identities, biographies and memories of participants. In this version of the generic ethnographic practice of hanging out, participants are accompanied on a natural outing which is rooted in everyday routines. The researcher asks questions, listens, observes, exploring the participants' practices and experiences as they move through and interact with their own physical and social environment. These interviews can provide insight into perception, spatial practices, personal biographies, the web of connections between people, and the patterns of social interactions. The method is also valued for giving some control to the participants, because it's their own sort of routes that you're walking through, and creating an enabling research environment. And people have used it with children from care and things like that, people who might need a little more support in the interview. There's another series of interviews where the researcher and researcher sort of move in further apart in time and space. Telephone, email, self-interviews and audio diaries. They can mediate the relationship and move the researcher and interviewee further apart. They can respond to each other asynchronically. You can use email so that one gets the email and the other one responds whenever they like. And sometimes there can be quite a long time in between the responses. Or synchronically using the appropriate software online. They might use text, as in these examples, or audio or video recorded responses. The researcher could be taking advantage of social networking sites to generate participants in the study and conduct the interview or undertaking an ethnography of a virtual community. All of these often technologically enhanced possibilities have advantages and disadvantages. They add skill needs for the researcher, they change the nature, dynamic and space of the qualitative interview and raise issues, including ethical concerns about researching virtual encounters. I might get through this sooner. Power and emotional dynamics in qualitative interviews. The cross-cutting social positions of both interviewer and interviewee can shape and shift power dynamics during the interview in complex ways. And interviewing can involve and generate a whole gamut of emotions and a degree of emotion work for all participants. Researchers are not neutral and objective inquirers in qualitative interviews, but they're emotionally engaged participants who are sharing an experience with the interviewee. And those who take a feminist and interpretive approach have argued that emotion is necessary to creating knowledge. People make sense of the social world through their emotions as well as cognition or intellect. And reflecting on the dynamics of power and emotions in the interview process can also provide insight about the substantive research topic. But there are also emotional costs for researchers who might perhaps be interviewing people whose stories are redolent with grief, loss, anger, resentment. Some contexts and topics can have strong emotional effects on the researcher and the participant. And from a psychosocial perspective in particular, power and emotions come together in both conscious and unconscious ways in qualitative interviews. Power can be more explicit, of course. You could be interviewing members of... 5 minutes. Maybe look at the wrong number up there. Power could be more explicit because you could be interviewing members of groups who are marginal or elite in society with concomitant implications for the positioning of the interviewer. Researchers can be members of the group that they're researching, which does give particular insights into people or practices arising from the membership. Teachers researching in schools, perhaps. A member of a rowing club researching the experience of rowing club members. This insider knowledge and experience can be a considerable advantage, but implicit knowledge of the group might also be a disadvantage. Both interviewee and researcher might assume certain knowledge on the part of the other and not make what they mean explicit. Although I found that quite useful when I was interviewing young people about sexuality, because they, quite often, it had to be done with like a nod and a wink or perhaps a laugh or something, but conveyed to each other what they were meaning. But as with all qualitative interviews, this issue raises ethical issues in which researchers must pay attention and make appropriate decisions, particularly in relation to, here, insider knowledge of and privileged access to participants. So, I hope that wasn't too speedy run through. Now I was going to look at, what's happening to qualitative interview in the current context. We who use qualitative interviews can see their value and importance and the contribution they make to social scientific understanding of the social world. They give insight into the meanings that individuals and groups attach to their own experiences, to social processes, practices and events, and to how those processes and relationships work. While technology and big data can pull policymakers in one direction, some seem to have a growing recognition of the values of qualitative research, often within the framework of mixed method, multimodal studies. There are even those who argue that we're in a cycle of increased acceptance of qualitative interviews and methods. But in contrast, I draw your attention to a debate that started in 2007 with Mike Savage and Roger Burrows, who suggested that the in-depth interview in the survey, which successfully provided access to the social for much of the 20th century, are increasingly dated research methods and are unlikely to serve well in the future. They warn about knowing capitalism. Welcome to the world of knowing capitalism, a world inundated with complex processes of social and cultural digitisation, a world in which commercial forces predominate and which we as sociologists are losing whatever jurisdiction we once had over the study of the social, as the generation, mobilisation and analysis of social data become ubiquitous. I'm talking about big data there. But they're very optimistic. They urge social scientists to recognise the gravity of the challenge and of knowing capitalism and big data, to engage with political debates over method and data, and to apply social theory to these accumulating data. And Les Back is also critical of the qualitative interview for its shortcomings, but he comes from a different direction. For him, the way that we've become dependent on the tape recorder and transcription has limited researchers and renders them less observant, less involved and less attentive to the social world. He argues that the interview cannot capture the complexity and immediacy of life in a hyper-connected society. As a potential solution, Back and his colleagues advocate live methods, multi-sensory and creative participatory methods that move into those spaces of connectivity, which embrace the digital society, involve collaboration with artists, designers, musicians and filmmakers, and incorporate new styles of sociological representation. And as researchers, we must, and we do indeed, attempt to keep up with and exploit technological change. But despite pressures from many quarters, we should probably avoid rushing blindly into innovatory methods of research, unless we understand that they will enable us to find answers for new questions that we face and generate better quality data and analysis than our old methods.